Great. Good afternoon, everyone. It's my great pleasure to introduce everybody to Innovation in Biotech in the time of COVID. This is our 12th webinar, and today is one of my favorite topics, which is fundraising for startups. I'm Steve Tregay. I'm Managing Director of Mission BioCapital and Chairman of the Board of LabCentral and former CEO of Therapeutics. We have a great panel today, and I'm really excited. This will be a terrific discussion as each of these companies have recently done very, very interesting financings that should span the entire spectrum of the type of questions that we should have on the panel today. So I'll let each of the panelists introduce themselves, and then we'll get into the questions. So why don't we start with Vikas and introduce yourself, please.
Thanks, Steve. Hi, everyone. This is Vikas Goyal. I'm the Senior Vice President of Business Development at Pandion Therapeutics. I joined the company initially as an investor and last year full-time to lead business development. I have a background in corporate strategy, venture capital, and business development.
Great. And Tim? Uh-oh. There we go.
Hi, sorry about that. Even after 6 months, I can't work out how to unmute. Afternoon, everyone. Tim Clackson, President and CTO at Xilio. I joined what was then called Akrivia about 2 years ago. And my background is in R&D and executive leadership roles. I spent the prior 20 years prior to Xilio as in various roles at Ariad Pharmaceuticals, including as President of R&D and CSO, so in targeted small molecule discovery and development. Prior to that, my background is in protein and antibody engineering at Genentech and then in academia.
Great. And Kasper?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Kasper Roet. I'm a CEO and co-founder of Quralis. My background is in gene therapy for spinal cord repair. I'm, I guess now a serial entrepreneur, started 3 companies. Quralis was actually my second. I started it 3.5 years ago. I call myself a molecular and cellular neurobiologist. And thank you for inviting me to the panel.
Well, great. And thank you all for joining today. And so maybe we can kick off by just giving everyone a bit of feedback or, background on your company, in particular, how it got started and how did you do the first financing. So while we mix things up, Tim, do you want to start with the days back at Akrivia?
Sure. So Akrivia has had an interesting biphasic birth, I guess. So the company was originally founded as a spin-out from City of Hope, just outside LA, based on academic work from a protein engineer there called John Williams. Seed funding came from F Prime over here. And the company initially worked really as an adjunct within John's lab. So for the first 2 years, there was an effort to really drive to proof of concept data. With that data in hand, around the end of 2017, F Prime came in with a full A round. And at the same time, Atlas was interested in getting into the space. And so they joined together. I should rewind and tell you what the company does. We are focused on tumor selective immunotherapies. At that time, it was really a play on antibodies and the idea that you could increase therapeutic index by bringing molecules in an inactive form. So the engineering worked. So based on that early proof of concept data, the A round came in, it was tranched. One of the conditions, and Steve in particular will enjoy hearing this, is that the company had to relocate to the East Coast, where of course the action is, and more importantly, where both the VC series.
And most importantly, LabCentral being more specific to the location.
And in one of several examples of good timing in our history, just as we were looking for space, LabCentral 610 was opening. And so we were lucky enough to get one of the first of the 7 slots there, initially really rattling around with lots of space, and by the end, bursting at the seams. So the next 2 years, we expanded our platform, changed our name initially by deleting some vowels from Akrivia to Akrivia, and then eventually changing to Xilio. We can talk a little bit more, I guess, later about the funding that we did, but our 2-year journey to within LabCentral led to us being able to exit just on the heels of a Series B that we closed at the end of this year, sorry, at the beginning of this year, for just over 100 million. in the same process as that fundraise, we also executed a name change and a kind of a rebranding, as well as a relocation. So it was interesting evolution.
That's great. Thanks, Tim. Kasper, why don't we come to you and tell us the story of Quralis? Always interesting, the name. So do want to hear the story. I love the Quralis part of the name as well.
Yeah, as many people probably know, it's difficult to get a name. Quralis is a precision medicine company for ALS, hence the name Quralis. 3.5 years ago, I was still working with Clifford Wolf and Kevin Eggen, two Harvard professors, on using stem cell technology to make a translational bridge, basically, from the genetic insights that we had obtained into the disease to the clinic. The animal models had always failed, and it's one of the reasons I came to Boston, or actually the reason I came to Boston, is to learn how to use patients' own cells to identify molecules, and then use those cells that we actually differentiated into neurons to immediately go to the clinic and basically skip the animal efficacy model, which had failed everyone. We worked together with large companies, Pfizer and GSK, but these companies reorganized, and all our work never got to the finish line. So Quralis is basically a product of a real drive to get to patients. And we realized what is needed in ALS is a precision medicine company, following the Vertex approach for cystic fibrosis, going after small subgroups of patients where we understand the biology, and then and hopefully combining different smaller populations until you have been able to help the majority of ALS patients. So 3.5 years ago, we started with that plan. And we started with some angel money to really solidify 3 different programs, and that we all thought had merit and really based on the science of our scientific founders and our scientific advisory board members. It was really after we won a golden ticket from Amgen in December 2017, which also led to a seed investment of Amgen, but most importantly, it led to our start also at LabCentral. It was a transformative moment for the company. We got a lot of press out of winning this prestigious golden ticket from Amgen, and also really started to get a lot of attention because we were at LabCentral and didn't realize what LabCentral was actually doing for us until we were there. It allowed me to hire the management team and all of that, and it led to the seed stage of the company, actually.
Great, thanks, Kasper. Vikas, and you'd started your relationship through an investment side, but could you maybe give a bit of background on kind of Pandion getting started and going?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the benefits of being in the Boston area is we have a lot of pharmas around here that like to evolve their strategy. And so our founders are Alan Crane, Joe Viney, and David Sachs. And Joe, she's an amazing scientist, terrific career. And when Biogen asked her to run discovery, but not immunology, she said, let me look and see what I can do outside of Biogen, right? So she was crashing, not at LabCentral, but very close by. So she was crashing in a conference room at KSQ, and also a Polaris company, and working with Alan Crane on ways to, instead of suppressing the immune system, let's try to activate the regulatory elements of the immune system. So that's the core focus of what we do at Pandion, is work on novel mechanisms for expansion of the regulatory T cell compartment, for agonism of PD-1, very different than in cancer where we're going to antagonize PD-1. We're working on agonist antibodies against PD-1. And also thinking about ways to target the immune system both systemically and in tissue. And so we also develop bifunctional antibodies. And so Joe started working out of KSQ for a few months, and then Polaris led a seed round alongside Alan Crane, who also invested himself. And in January 18, so just a few months after they started noodling on the company, We had to start making some big payments to some phage display vendors and other kinds of important antibody discovery partners. Had hired a few of our initial core scientists. And so we did the Series A in January 2018. Polaris and Versant led the Series A with Roche Venture Fund, and that's when I got involved. So SR1, where I used to work, GSK's venture fund, we also invested in the Series A, as did Johannes through, at the time, BioInnovation, now Mission Bio. We also ended up bringing JDRF T1D fund in as a part of the Series A eventually as well. And so we have a core focus on type 1 diabetes. That's partnered now with Astellas. And that Series A really helped us build the platform. Working at LabCentral, we were able to recruit just like awesome talent and build the company. We eventually moved to 610 as well, the quote unquote graduation space where we could have a few more scientists in. And then ultimately we continued growing, and we're now based in Watertown, which, sort of like the new Kendall Square, I guess, though I'd rather have
warm on that one, I guess.
Yeah.
Before Watertown.
Yeah, the coffee at Area 4 is a little bit better than the coffee at the Starbucks in Target, but none of that matters right now anyway. Yeah, we ended up doing a Series B earlier this year, and at that time brought in a couple of, traditionally kind of public-focused investors. And so, now we can call it a crossover round because we did complete our IPO. But we brought in Tavistock, Boxer Capital, RA, Access Bio, and OrbiMed, and all of our Series A investors also participated. And given the uncertainties around COVID and what we saw is just a real openness and willingness to fund early stage companies in the public capital markets, we very quickly turned around and got our S1 filed and went public in mid-July. And so we are now, we're now funded into 2024, which is a great position to be in. Yeah. And I say this is and I'll just say, I'll throw this off comment in and I'll stop, which is my goal for every seed stage company is one day you should earn more in interest than you did in your entire seed round. And I think we will now get there. So that should be your goal. Just think of it. One day you can have enough money in the bank that you'll have more in interest in your seed round.
There you go. That is quite a good aspiration. I think that's great. Yeah. So that's actually a great pivot to talk a little bit about, financing, and each of you has gone through kind of a transformative financing. So let's dig in a little bit to that. So, key things that we want to talk about, what were the key catalysts, from a scientific perspective, when was it the right time to raise money? And what were some of those internal and external kind of things? So Kasper, maybe we'll mix it up and have you go next and talk about those kind of key things as you were getting up to doing the nice round that you recently closed.
Yeah, I'd be happy, Steve. So as I just said, that was kind of, getting into LabCentral was really the seed stage of our company. That was like the beginning of 2018. At that moment, our programs were crystallized, but they were still pretty early. And what we wanted to do is raise a Series A to bring our programs to the clinic, but we were too early to actually get significant investment amounts into the company at that time. So what we did is we increased the seed investors. Was actually led by BioInnovation Capital, Mitsubishi Tanabe Pharma came in, Amgen Ventures, Alexandria Ventures, and Viva Ventures. And basically we had enough money, 8.5 million, to really progress our programs. And at the same time, we started to look at can we potentially make a jump by a good in-licensing opportunity? So we really started to explore that space, and we started to work together with Lilly as well to see if there was any opportunity there. And so when I think about it, that's kind of was about a 1-year process where we actually very rapidly progressed the molecules, and we had a really good year at that time, I must say, where everything kind of fell into place. And so 3 programs actually moved forward really rapidly. We brought in a new technology also, antisense oligonucleotide technology. We brought in Sudhir Agarwal into our company who invented that, the gapmer chemistry that is very successful in the clinic right now. And so very rapidly we had both ASOs and small molecules. And our programs were also helped by an external factor. That is that Spinraza, which was an ASO therapy for spinal muscular atrophy, turned out to work really well. And that actually works on motor neurons in the spinal cord of humans, which is the same cell that dies in ALS patients. And then not very rapidly, but sometime after that, Biogen also showed a good result with an ALS subgroup of patients focused on SOD1. And so suddenly there was a belief also within investors that yes, this strategy that worked for Vertex can also work for ALS. You can identify these patients. We have modalities that actually work. And Quralis has really exciting programs focused on specific patient populations that we can identify by biomarkers, by genetics, and with modalities that are known to work already. And so we got a lot of traction from that. In the end, Polaris came and led our round together with Mission BioCapital and InCev, Troya Ventures, and the Dementia Discovery Fund, and a number of other investors participated as well, such as Dolby Ventures, Mitsui Global Investors, and Sanford Biosciences. And we kind of catalyzed very, very quickly from a $25 million Series A, which was our initial idea to get to the clinic, towards a $42 million Series A right in the middle of the COVID pandemic. And when COVID broke out, I was a little concerned, and I called all the investors that were lining up to support us and said, like, what's going on and how is this going to impact your appetite for investments? And fortunately, the parties that I talked to were not impacted on that. Their funds were solidified and we could move forward as planned. And this deal with Lilly that we announced a couple of weeks ago was already in the making, obviously, at that time. And it was also really a significant component of this financing coming together. So I think a lot of things just fell into place. Most of all, it's real progress. The team did a phenomenal job, and we're really well set up to get to the clinic next year now. And the investors are incredibly excited about the precision medicine approach that we have for ALS.
No, that's great. And I think a lot of that was a very, visionary view. People could see where the success was in other areas, because obviously ALS is a real challenging area. So to give people that real reason to believe, right?
Yeah, that's true. But yeah, as I said, it's challenging. It's been in the past, it's been pursued by just, trying out things. We're not in that time anymore. We're starting to understand diseases. Cancer is the best example of that. By being a repeated record, Vertex cystic fibrosis, perfect example of that. Once you know what is driving the disease, you can actually develop a very targeted therapy. And so now the landscape is for ALS is different than it used to be before. We know how to succeed. We don't know it for every patient yet, but we know it for some patients. And I think that is what you need to be successful.
Yeah, it's important to understand the importance of timing and where the field is for that. So Tim, shifting gears and talking about your round of financing, right over $100 million that you guys closed. Give us some background on that. And then importantly, kind of what were some of the key catalysts for you guys, both internally and externally?
Sure. So it's interesting hearing Kasper talk about the 1-year timeframe, because that's pretty much the timeframe we were working on. Not deliberately, but that's what it turned out to be. So start at the end, we raised a 100.5 million Series B in February this year. We announced it and booked the final group. But if you rewind a year, we realized at the beginning of 2019 that we probably needed to raise. Our A had been a bit on the small side for the scope of the programs we wanted to run. So we started dipping our toes in the water at JP Morgan 2019, just meeting with a pretty aspirational slide deck. The main differentiator for our programs we felt was IL-2, the concept that you could have a tumor-selective cytokine and really grab that strong potency that's been seen with IL-2, but it's very, very toxic. So an important aspect of that thesis is that IL-2 is validated, again, to the point similar to what Kasper was saying, you're kind of de-risking the biology as much as you can. And so therefore it's more of a kind of a targeted approach. Nevertheless, we did run into what was then pretty strong headwinds against immunotherapy and IO. In the cancer world, this pendulum swings between targeted therapies and IO, and courtesy of Loxo, it was definitely on the targeted side around that time. So initially, we didn't have a lot of great traction. One issue was also that our data wasn't that mature. We did not have non-human primate data, and so I'll get to that later. And long story short, it was a mixture of both internal and external factors that led us to success. So one early success was that we had an early believer, a corporate venture fund that came in. They weren't able to lead or put in a chunk of money, but they said, yeah, we love it, we're in, we're patient, we'll wait. And they were also willing to speak to other investors and share their diligence. So that was really helpful to have early on in the April to May timeframe. And then in June, we rounded out our team, added Renee Rousseau as our CEO. She brought a broader Rolodex and also had a COO on board. And then as that joint team, we kind of relaunched ourselves. The science had moved on and we were beginning to get really interesting data. But again, we were having trouble getting that traction. And the key challenge was finding someone to jump in and commit to lead. At that point, we were looking to raise between 60 and 80, ideally 80. But we could make do with 60 with a few compromises on other programs. We eventually were able to get a commitment from a fund to lead, and they eventually led the round. That was Takeda Ventures. As soon as Takeda came in, and I'd say what was very useful there is that we had multiple routes of contact into different levels of Takeda, which has helped to really build confidence with the team. Once we had that in place, then it became a lot easier to go back to those funds that had expressed interest but were just a little bit nervous to jump in. And so an early syndicate came together quite nicely. And that was helped by us getting our first non-human primate data so we could flip up a slide, which, thank goodness, it really showed exactly what we wanted it to show. So that really helped. And then the external stuff starts to kick in. So we worked to close our round, led by Takeda, and did a soft close just before Thanksgiving. But we left open the possibility that we could go a bit higher than the amount we closed then. And that turned out to be a really good step and lesson learned, because we just came back from our Thanksgiving vacations, and out of the blue, Sanofi acquired Syntherex for $2.5 billion. Syntherex, as Vikas knows, is another IL-2 company seeking to make a pegylated extended half-life IL-2 and a number of other molecules. So that was a real wake-up call, I think, not only for the science and that apparent validation, but also just from a business point of view that pharma are now willing to slap down big checks again for IO. So that plus the 47 acquisition and other things had that pendulum swinging back. More to the point, it made the investors who had come into our first close look like geniuses because they had invested in a company that was now in a hot field. So we were able, based on that, to do 2 additional closes to bring in additional investors, ultimately to take it up to that 100.5 number, north of what we had initially thought we would be able to get, or even maybe want to get, but that really gave us breadth to have flexibility. And then 3 weeks later, COVID happened. So again, it was very fortuitous timing. So elements of success were luck, for sure. Also, having that early anchor investor to give us faith and also to point other investors to, and and building in that flexibility, planning for success, if you like, making sure the documents are able to accommodate another board member, another investor. And the only other challenge was that when you stretch out an investment that long and the data change, at some point you start to get questions about valuation. So I think that's something to bear in mind. You can't endlessly keep things open. So I'll leave it there, but it was a fun trip.
Yeah, what a great story. And yeah, it's interesting how the pendulum and IO and back and forth has definitely come and gone. So one has to always be cognizant of what's happening outside. So Vikas, now, tell us a little bit about kind of the crossover into the IPO, because obviously pulling off a great IPO like you guys did in COVID must have been kind of interesting, not doing the classic road shows and everything.
Yeah, it was, for us, it was really the way the Series B happened that gave us confidence to go into the IPO process. One of the things that has not changed in the COVID environment is the structure of an IPO requires very strong support from the existing investors. And that is the way to get a good syndicate of IPO bankers around the table. That is the way to catalyze that kind of public financing. And it continues to be the case for biotech companies. And so when we were thinking about the Series B, our lead program was in pretty advanced preclinical development, and we had a good sense of us starting the phase 1 study early in 2020. We knew that was happening. We also knew that we were about to announce the Astellas collaboration that was reasonably far along in negotiations. And so we sort of said, why don't we, let's get the Astellas collaboration announced. And then we have several months until we're going to kick off the clinical study. So we could either do a financing now, or we could do a financing, once we're a clinical stage company, and let's, see what's better for the current investors. As we went through that process, we talked to a large number of investors, traditional venture investors, traditional public investors, and folks who are more traditional kind of crossover kind of investors. And we really got lucky with Syntherex as well. So 2 of our Series B investors were investors in Syntherex and had interest in the immunology autoimmune work that they were doing as well in IL-2, and were able to do very deep technical diligence on our program. We also had, ever since the Series A, there were a handful of investors that we were continuing to have semi-regular updates with. And so that helped as well. At least one of them came in to help with that Series B financing. And then when Access and Tavistock stepped up to lead it, it was clear that we had that support then to do an IPO, right? And so then we kind of papered the Series B, got it done, and basically orged up with our bankers within weeks of that. We had already been having conversations with a number of potential biotech banks. We had introduced the company to a lot of their research analysts. We had our financial systems in pretty good shape. We've been working with the folks at Danforth Advisors for a very long time, and that helps a lot to just have your books in good shape. We have good corporate counsel as well. We work with Wilmer Hale and Leah Demardrasorian's team there. Just a lot of experience taking companies public. So we had, I think, the infrastructure in place that we could, basically for us, the gating item was writing the S1 as opposed to getting the infrastructure in place, which was really lucky. And then we just, tried to get it done as quickly as possible. The virtual environment happened in the middle of all of this, right? So we were at, the Cowen conference, right, in person. And then we were in, term sheet negotiations, all that stuff happened pre-COVID, or at least pre-Boston realizing COVID, right? It was already happening in other parts of the world. And then the week the money was supposed to wire is when everything shut down in the US. Thankfully, the money came in. And then, after that, everything was virtual, right? And it's a very interesting dynamic going through the IPO, testing the waters and roadshow discussions via Zooms. It's very intense and packed. It's also very efficient. It is not the brutal 2-week traveling nonstop process that I think it's like doctors in residency. It's like everybody's supposed to do it, right? But it sucks, and I'm glad we didn't have to do it. I'm assuming we will do it once again.
Public, I think, is what they normally thought. Wouldn't do it unless you were sure you wanted to, right?
Yeah, but it also changes the dynamics a lot. So our team, we were all in our homes, right? And we had to get to the feel for doing the presentation when we weren't physically together. We didn't have, you don't have those like Uber rides in between investor meetings where you can, debrief and say, we should say that a little differently. So it's a very different kind of dynamic where you're just back to back to back. We met about 40 investors over the course of that process, which is probably what one would do in a traditional kind of process, but just much faster. Questions about, is it worth going to Europe or Denver? Like, it's irrelevant now. So you can expose yourself to a much larger number of investors, which is good and also more demanding. But I think, on balance, it really is, I think, a testament to the power of the capital markets here for biotech. It's just there are investors who are focused on this space. Some of the public investors who came into the company, had years of immunology experience themselves. There's just like a very sophisticated group of investors around biotech right now at all stages of a company's life.
Yeah, and actually that's a great segue. We opened it up for Q&A and we've already had a few in. So those that are online can type in questions. And one of those actually ties to choosing the right investors, right? Obviously, I think all of you have touched on the really important aspects of, either they played a very pivotal role in help catalyzing your rounds or obviously supporting the IPO. Maybe going back, why don't we go back to Kasper, thoughts on kind of how maybe we had some questions as well on the early seed financing and stuff. How do you think about, those early groups, the roles of disease foundations, et cetera, and being involved in the company?
Yeah, there's a lot of answers to that.
It is an open-ended question for sure.
Yeah. I heard one of your colleagues once say, Steve, take the money. So that's one rule. When we started Quralis, we thought that because there are a lot of wealthy families affected, unfortunately, by ALS, and we thought that's how we will finance the seed stage of the company. And then we thought foundations would be very excited about having an ALS-focused company. And so we ran into a little problem there, is that there are a lot of more fortunate individuals, but all their relationships were already established. And they didn't have much space actually for a new entity. And the foundations thought it was complicated to have a commercial investment with money that is donated by people. And what people really wanted is to fund clinical trials to get a therapy right now to themselves or the people that they love. So in the end, that actually wasn't that successful for us. The angels were friend and family, which really got us started, I think. And they were associated with one of the founding partners, a company called Q-State for a large part. But what was much more successful for us were the strategics. And so we were not the only ones seeing that the ALS opportunity was changing and that we were actually going into a time that we can make meaningful therapies for ALS patients. And the strategics saw the team that we had put together, saw the programs that we had put together, which are really phenomenal. I mean, we brought really the world leaders in both research and academia, in industry, and in the clinic together in our tiny little company. And the programs were a product of like 5 to 10 years of work from our academic founders and scientific advisory board members, very solid. And the strategics saw the opportunity for that, Amgen and Mitsubishi, and that really catalyzed, I think, the company. And after the strategics come in, that's kind of a validation also for people that don't understand every little detail about such a disease area, but it's kind of been vetted already. And so that's when institutional investors started to come in as well. And then the follow-up on that was actually what I just explained with just progressing the programs in the company to the stage that you are close enough to the clinic for people to actually put more money behind it.
Yeah, and actually building a little bit on the strategics, because obviously one of the great things with LabCentral is we have, virtually all of the pharmas as sponsors. Yes. They're engaged, they're involved. Tim, maybe going to you, obviously.
Sorry, if I can make one comment to that, Steve, because I think that's relevant for what you just said. When I moved into LabCentral, I didn't expect to sit next to Roche and next to J&J, like 5 feet away from my office. And I mean, that was really meaningful as well. That's a really good
that early advice
was a real catalyst for us.
That's great. And Tim, maybe you could touched a little bit and maybe build on the importance of Takeda, and then Vikas, it'd be great to hear a little bit how important the transformative deal with Astellas is on, because obviously that was a big part of the story as well, I'm sure, in terms of raising the rounds.
Sure. I'll start with an even better LabCentral story, which is that when we were presenting to Pfizer, we actually used the Akrivia Wi-Fi because it was stronger than the Pfizer Wi-Fi, because it was literally next door to our lab in LabCentral. Building. The hidden benefits. So yeah, proximity to Takeda, both for the management team and also geographically was really critical. But yeah, taking a step back, one of the features of our ultimate B round was it was pretty heavy in strategics and obviously led by a strategic. That wasn't, to be honest, the way we went into the round thinking it would play out, or maybe not the way you would pick, but it turned out to be very, very successful. Takeda had the vision and the strategic interest in cytokines, and it turned out that several other companies were quietly building their own interest in that area at a time when maybe the classical VCs were a little bit more anti-IO, but the strategics were, depending on your viewpoint, either behind the curve or ahead of the curve, already following the pendulum or leading the pendulum the other way. They also brought in a number of smaller funds that they often co-invest with, and those ended up actually building up quite a bit of the balance of the first close that we had before we had our whoosh of second closings. So academic endowments such as Harvard came in, Columbia came in. We had a couple of Asia-specific funds that came in for a small amount, a few million, but they ended up adding up. And they also brought their own, it turns out many of them have done a lot of work in this space and really had insights to bring. So while our first close was spread out among a number of different funds, it was kind of strength in depth in a way. And that was really led by the strategics. Ultimately, we did have a couple of traditional VCs come in, pretty big. So SV, Rivervest were two of those. So that was an important dynamic. And I think the flip side is, of course, if you have a board that has a number of strategics on it, that can be a little bit complicated as you move on. But everyone's going in with their eyes open. So I think that's worked out well for us.
That's great. And Vikas, talk a little bit about the Astellas relationship.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So it used to be the case that I think corporate partnership for a platform company was like just, table stakes. Like you had to have one if you were going to raise capital. And that's not the case anymore. I think there are many companies that have successfully raised a fair amount of investor capital without having to do that deal. And some investors even don't like deals now because they want, they're greedy. They want to own all the assets themselves. And so, one of the things that that we found in our discussion. So first, Astellas is a really good partner, right? And they have a great reputation of being supportive of the early stage companies they work with. People know that they're interested in autoimmune disease. They've done deals in protein engineering platforms, including in the Boston area, right? So, and their innovation team here in Boston is also like people like them and know them, right? So that, I think that helps that, it's a partner that is respected and people like working with them. And then again, things that just happened to your benefit, they did this multi-billion-dollar acquisition of Audentes, and and all of a sudden people are like, oh wow, like you have a partner who puts real money to work, right? And obviously they have a very different strategic emphasis in gene therapy right now. They've done a number of deals there, but things like that really help when you're working with a company that is just well regarded. And I think it also helped people feel comfortable with, we're trying to develop a broad pipeline, and we have a platform approach that could address many different autoimmune diseases. There's always the question of how are you going to do that? Where are these resources going to come from? How many different programs can we fund? Investors will want you to focus on the near-term stuff, and having a partner in that context, I think it just helps everybody feel comfortable that, this company is approaching resource allocation and strategic decisions in a thoughtful way. They're doing things that will continue building the company. They're not giving everything away. They're not asking investors to fund everything, right? They're just balancing. And I think I continue to think that a corporate partnership is helpful to have in the right context and at the right deal terms. It can be a very helpful thing for any small company to have. You don't need it. And so that gives you the flexibility to do the deal when you want to. Right?
Yeah. And I think I always tell people, you have to look at dilution across everything, right? If you do a certain partnership, it's dilutive to your pipeline, but accretive to your non-dilutive funding. I think the way you put it, right, being very thoughtful, type 1 diabetes being a really important area, very important to visionary companies like Astellas, but also one that, would be a huge impact, but a big, clinical development opportunity. So finding the right balance and trying to tie it back to the story, I think, is always very key. So actually, time's flown. We actually only have a few minutes left. So I just wanted to give everyone one last chance to any just advice in terms of, we have a lot of folks who are looking to all of you as having successfully navigated this path forward to financing. Any last bit of advice to people fundraising, and in particular, fundraising coming out of LabCentral and in these times? Why don't we start with you, Tim, and mix things up?
I think executive summary is this is actually a great time to finance, and who would have thought it? But there's not only a lot of money out there, but there's a lot of positive sentiment. We're seeing, in the most unfortunate circumstance, that science matters, and investors really see the potential for making a difference with biotech, and also an industry that's relatively insulated from everything else that's going on financially. So we've definitely seen that in our both the financing I talked about and in our ongoing discussions. I do think to Vikas's point that the glass is half full with regard to efficiency of fundraising. It might be intense to do back-to-back raises, but I don't think that the IPO roadshow is ever coming back. I think that's
that might be a good permanent change.
Yeah. So there's a lot of reasons to be positive, both logistical and cyclical.
That sounds great. Kasper, any final thoughts from your side?
I guess the lesson I learned is raise the amount of money that fits with your company. Otherwise, you're just wasting your own time and you're wasting investors' time. Just be cognizant of where you are, and what your next inflection point is, and have that story be very targeted to the investors that fit that story, basically. So I think that's an advice I want to give the LabCentral community. Something that I could have done better, I think.
Well, I think we all, it's definitely good, clear advice. That's great. And Vikas, last thoughts before we wrap up here, right at the end of the time here.
Yeah, I agree with everything that my co-panelists have said. You know, my one advice is if you're gonna launch an investor outreach process, you should also launch an industry outreach process and try to get investors and industry to compete with each other if you can. And you know, if you're at a stage where it could be of interest to investors, it's probably at a stage where it could be of interest to industry as well. And you never know which party is going to be more interested in what you have until you can get the term sheets.
That's great.
And so that I think going to get those term sheets is, from any party you can, it's a clarifying moment. And you should try to get one from investors and also one from industry if you can. One will be better than the other.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I think the flexibility that places like LabCentral provide is kind of that optionality that, and we're seeing interesting deal terms occurring preclinically, right? So, looking at that as a true alternative to financing, whether it's a deal or maybe even an M&A. So with that, I think we'll have to wrap up. This has been a great discussion. We could have gone on for hours. I'd like to just thank all of the panelists for their great participation, their open feedback. It was great stories and really great to have all of you share that. Just as a reminder, we'll have another one of these coming up in September. So I hope you can join us at that time. And thanks again to everybody. And thanks for all the audience participation and the great questions. And we'll see you all soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve.
Bye-bye.